steps to producing ideal game textures for your Unity project. We'll take a look at UVs, sculpting to generate base and normal maps, the advantages of 3D painting, Photoshop tips, and finally, ideal file formats for export. The most important starting point in any texture workflow for a Unity project is the texture coordinates, or for that matter, the UV layout of your asset. Let's take a look at some tips to avoid problems with textures as they relate to UV layout. Here we are in Maya. Now Maya has some very powerful and fast tools for helping you lay out UVs. A handy feature is the ability to preview a shaded representation of the UV layout to identify any overlapping issues. For example, this could be corners of an object where the UVs are folded or stacked underneath other UVs. This is a great way to quickly identify any areas that will create issues at texture painting time. Keep your UVs packed together so that they are not overlapping, but that they have enough space in between to allow for sufficient texture bleed. This is especially important for 3D painting. However, keep in mind it is okay if you ever want to share a texture by splitting the model in half, stacking the UVs over top of each other, and in that case you're utilizing the exact same texture on either side of the model. Now let's look at a workflow for creating textures. One of the most convenient texture painting workflows is to combine the convenience of painting in 3D with the power of Adobe Photoshop. In this example, I'm using Autodesk Mudbox for sculpting and painting in conjunction with Photoshop. This zombie duck character is very light and simple, so we want to bring out some detail with texture maps. This is where sculpting comes in handy for creating effects such as this band-aid, or an overall knitted feel that matches with the game theme. Once our sculpting is finished, we can head over to our map extraction settings and begin to output some maps that will be very useful as texture painting starting points. I always start with extracting or baking an ambient occlusion map as well as a normal map. By default, Mudbox will place these textures as paint layers so that you can start working with them. It's a good practice to paint your textures at a higher resolution than you require. It's always easier to down-res than it is to up-res. It's also a best practice to keep your textures to the power of 2, that is, a square resolution, for example 1024 by 1024 or 2048 by 2048. This is most ideal for optimized performance in Unity. We can now begin to create our base layers. Flooding a layer with a simple color like this muted yellow and applying a multiply blend to mix the ambient occlusion in is an excellent way to start to lay out our texture. Using 3D painting to quickly place details like the stripes across the character is much easier than guessing how it will line up in a 2D format. However, when we have a good base set up, we can simply connect our Mudbox painting workflow to Photoshop and take advantage of all the powerful tools there. One of the great things about this workflow is that a UV wireframe is automatically generated and can be used as a reference for placing and adjusting textures. Here we can use advanced sharpening and color correction tools to give our texture a more refined look. Here's a handy Photoshop blending tip. Duplicate your ambient occlusion layer. Adjust the multiply blending down to around 60%, and then change the duplicated layer to an overlay blend at 60%. Next, with your normal map imported, take the green channel and multiply or overlay and adjust as desired. This produces more depth in your textures and really helps bring the character to life. Once we have our maps ready to use, save them into your Unity project texture directory. Unity gives you the ability to adjust how the textures will be handled with a compression setting for each map. This allows for adjusting the quality that you require while keeping performance in Unity high. Let's review some tips for ideal texture painting for Unity workflows. Use properly laid out UVs. Keep textures to the power of 2. Always work at a larger resolution than required. It's always easy to down-res. Use ambient occlusion and normal maps for starting points. Reuse paint layers for blending effects, for example, ambient occlusion and normal maps. Finally, use target or .tga formats for alpha, or stick with JPEG or PNG for simple RGB maps. Unity can compress your maps to save memory in your project. Using textures to bring out the detail in models is the true secret to producing nice assets for your Unity workflows. As we have seen in this overview of best practices for texturing for Unity, a few simple tips and tricks can help you get your project started and looking nice.